So this is anecdotal, but if you look at the Western media is playing this because they are doing the bidding of Emmanuel Macron and the French right. They are already trying to divide and conquer, where they're saying Africans are burning France, and that's the narrative that even quote unquote liberal corporate medias are running with. They're running with the narrative that it's Muslims and African that's mostly discontent. And once again, this is anecdotal. I will say this, but I'm doing my job as a citizen journalist. I know someone who has a son in France, and she talked to her son, and she was like, it's unbelievable how the West covering it, because the West is covering it as a race war, and the French right is help pushing that because they want to delegitimize the protests. But they paint it as African and Muslim against the white French. Meanwhile, my friend said she has something like, no, this is the proletariat. This is workers that are. This is like the spark plug. This police killing is the French people having enough. Now, not only are they upset about the police killing, they are making demands as well. Demands for the proletariat, demands that Emmanuel Macron must meet. And as these demands are being made, as this real organization is happening, and they are actually engaging in base tactics, as far as I'm concerned, you have the Western media that is engaging in very predictable capitalist divide and conquer, and many of the quote-unquote right-wing populists are falling for it. They're going with this. Oh, the migrants are burning down France. The migrants are burning down France. Meanwhile, on the ground in France, they just see their brother fighting against this system that everyone is tired of. So how and then my last part of this bill, how ironic is it that so many right wingers who hate Emmanuel Macron is now running to a defense, running defense for him. Man, it seems like there's some outside threat instead of the threat of the government. Right, but anyone else want to try? I got a lot to say about that. I'm literally gonna do Nick at Night. Dude, I can't even cover everything on this segment.
It's too much.
I'm back to you guys. I don't want to rant on there.
I brought up a little bit of this on the show, and look, remember, it wasn't too long ago where there was 800,000 plus French workers who were protesting against Emmanuel Macron's rise of the retirement age. This is a powder keg that's ready to explode. Look at the anger. Look at the resentment. Look at how people have been pushed. And eventually, sooner or later, there's going to be a point to where there is the straw that breaks the camel's back. No one can take it anymore. We, the United States, we're world heavyweights in having political corruption, but the amount of political corruption that we have here in the United States also is within Europe, and these neoliberal policies that we're seeing firsthand, the people are pushing back. And to which I have to say, the French, at least they have more courage than the American citizen. I mean, look at what we're going through, and we're just taking it. People are snapping, and they are angry, and rightfully so. There's only so much crap a person can take until eventually everyone's in agreement. No, burn it all down.
No.
Well, I think it was as recent as like 2017 when a lot of the French police started arming themselves, and they started putting out these new guidelines for when
they had to change the law.
Right, they had to change the law, and so Nick, you've talked about a lot that we in the U.S. are the most propagandized people on the planet, and I think this kind of speaks to that because there's the sense here that the police they shot this teenager, but they got arrested, and so what's the problem, right? Isn't that the system working? Because that's how we're kind of trained to think about this in America, because here, when a cop is held responsible for killing someone, that's considered this big victory because it doesn't happen all that often here, right? In other countries, in a country like France, a police killing is a shocking and traumatic thing, right? They're not used to taking this shit as much as we are. And there were 13 police killings at traffic stops last year in France, which was a record. And there have been more this year. And a majority of those killings were perpetrated against Africans. And so, you're seeing a very forceful response to something that is not as normalized over there as it is over here.
And to that point, Keaton, and that's a great point. I don't know, like everyone freaking out about this, and this is a big deal. I don't want to undermine this. This is a big deal, but a lot of people forget about 2005 in France. Like there was 2 teenagers that was fled from the cops, and I'm trying to remember exactly what happened, but they ran into some electrical equipment. They were electrocuted.
Yeah, so this was 2005. I always say, being from New York, I have an ear for almost every accent except French because they don't move. I'm not like, there's no French neighborhood, so I don't have it in my ear. So I'm going to say this really badly. So after World War II, they started building what were supposed to be kind of commuter suburbs for the working class. They're called banlieue. I'm sure I said that horribly. Um, so originally that was French working class, but after the Algerian War, it started to become an immigrant area. And it's very, very much like housing projects here, very underfunded, a lot of hopelessness, lack of opportunity, lack of jobs. So there have been riots there periodically since 1979. But the biggest one, the one that this is being compared to, is in 2005. They had 3 weeks of riots after 2 teenagers were electrocuted trying to evade the police.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's to Keaton's point that when this kind of stuff happened in France, they don't take it. But I want to because this is actually kind of a new thought I've been developing in terms of having sympathy for the American people, because there is a conversation I was listening to. It was a Black Twitter space, and they was talking about how Black Americans, especially the trauma we've been through. Our leaders have been executed. Ferguson activists were actively murdered. Generations of being beaten by police. And the thought and the main premise of this space is, why aren't Black Americans rising up against our police state, which is on the numbers way worse? Because you, as Ken's point, this is them freaking out over one killing, even though we are there's 3 police killings a day in the United States. So why aren't we doing the same thing as the French?
Are there 3 a day? It's 3 a day.
Yeah, that's the latest. Wow. That's the number I read like a year ago. God knows what it is now. That's the report I saw when we reported on that last year. But there's been there's been so much trauma among the American people, and there's this explicit message that the United States government will kill you, and they will do it illegally. And this is why I have the hard stance against state violence that I do, and we need more people in solidarity with our community to stand up against state violence, because honestly, the Black community and indigenous people are tired, man. So it's easy to be like, yeah, why are the French doing it but not America? Because America, we've been killed, we've been executed, and the French and Emmanuel Macron is showing his Western fascist tendencies, because he replied with tactical armed units and armed vehicles against his populace, and he is now engaging in tactics that the United States have been doing for decades. But this, when you see these clips, like you seeing this now, and you see the tactics that was even used during Hong Kong and other protests, I feel like the American working class can learn from this, can learn from the rejection of pacifism. But it's hard for me to really blame Americans for not going this hard, because we live in a uniquely violent, a uniquely oppressive state. I was at the George Floyd tear gas, and they Floyd Floyd protest, and they tear gas children, guys. Anyway, so that's the only thing I can say. I have sympathy, and I try not to get into. I was talking to Misty about this literally earlier today on Twitter. Like, I try not to get into defeatism, because I think we always have revolutionary optimism. But when you see the amount of violence our state perpetuates, and the people that justify that, it's like, man, it's very hard to imagine that we could ever uprise the way French do. Because even we do, a few people get killed and we get scared away, and then you got bootlickers on the right, bootlickers on the liberal media that fight against them. So it's hard. I'll try not to get into the defeatism, but it's very hard to see something like that happen in the United States with our current political climate. And it's very hard to blame the people in a lot of ways. That's just the new thought process I kind of have. But I want you guys get you guys started. We can pass CJ. We can move on as well.
Well, we give our police a license to kill here in ways that other countries don't necessarily do, right? And so, when a thing like this happens in France, yeah, these happen with far more rarity there than they do here. But because of that, it's all the more shocking when it does happen, because they don't empower police to crack the citizens' necks the way we do. When we empower the cops in that way, when a killing happens or even when a mistake happens, right? You could chalk it up to, well, we give these guys a license to kill. Mistakes are going to happen. Things aren't going to go the way we want them to all the time. And so that's how we get lulled into this sort of complacency, right?
Yeah, and
but in France, they don't think of the cops as people who go around with a license to kill. And so when something like this happens, it is shocking. It is like, you mean they stopped a kid at a traffic stop and they killed him?
Well,
like
this has been happening increasingly since they changed the law. There have been, 22 of these shootings since 2020. So after they changed the law, they started that.
They're on the rise. But what I mean by this, like, not every country thinks of the cops the way we do, right? We treat our police forces as literally occupying forces in some of these places. They roll in with fucking tanks. I mean, they look like an occupying army. In Europe, in a lot of European countries, they don't, which makes it all the more traumatic when a thing like this happens, because they're like, we didn't give you the power to do this. What the fuck happened? And then you get what you got now.
Absolutely. And I'm asking just a rhetorical question to Russell's point. Why do you guys think French changed their laws? Now, this is why I'm an abolitionist, right? This is why I think if you're a populist, and this is why if you want actual change in these violent neoliberal states, you got to speak out against the police state, because it's obvious to me that the West is shoring up their police states in anticipation of social unrest that is to come due to late-stage capitalism. And you talk about the communities that the Algerians and many Africans are suffering in France and the hopelessness that they have. The police state in France is shoring up in anticipation of their unrest. The same way the United States, we allowed our police state to get so powerful, we can't even remotely pull off what they do in France. That's why it's absurd to me that people call themselves populist or anti-establishment and they support the blue. The blue will always side with the state, and they're here to squash this kind of content. And in this story, among every other protest or riot story, it shows why us as a proletariat need to limit the amount of power of the police to the best of our ability, which we highlight in the 10 demands, and we highlight ways you can limit the power of your local police the best you can. We got to do that until we get to the state where the proletariat is more powerful than the police state. But anyway, I'll pass the CJR the panel. We can move on.
Well,
go ahead.
We just had the anniversary of Stonewall. And if you go and you sit down and you read the history of Stonewall and what happened that day, what is going to strike you is they did what and didn't get killed by the police? What? The police were barricaded in the bar. They called for backup. The police car came and the people attacked the police car and it drove away. What? Tanks didn't come in? They didn't kill anybody? The Stonewall riots would be impossible today. They'd kill them. They would kill them. They would never allow it to get that far. That is the result of having a militarized police force like that. You could not have that kind of a movement today without people getting killed.
Yeah, what's up? Go ahead, CJ.
All right. Let me play the video and then we can get our last comments on the friends. But this is corporate media's take on
a fourth straight day of violent clashes in France. Demonstrators are protesting the death of a 17-year-old boy who was shot and killed by police during a traffic stop.
Cars were set on fire, as you see there. Buildings have been damaged in major cities across France, resulting in more than 1,300 arrests overnight. But so far, the French government has resisted calls to impose a state of emergency. Let's go now to CNN's Nick Robertson, live this morning from Paris. Nick, what's the latest? What are the scenes like this morning?
Yeah, the French government's taken a graduated approach. The arrests were up last night, but there were more police out. They had more heavily armored vehicles at their disposal. There were more restrictions in place. No big gatherings allowed. Buses and trams were taken off the streets at 9 p.m. last night. 2 police officers were shot. The violence not as bad as it has been in and around Paris, although it was bad. We're still talking about 1,350 cars set on fire, 26 city halls attacked, 24 schools attacked.
See the focus?
So the numbers are still big.
Yeah, no, you guys see this accident, and I want the clip to keep playing, but I'll make this point quick. In the very beginning of the segment, you want to know what one of the first words that they said? Violence. If you want to replay it, like the first few seconds, they make sure you got to think that's an accident. The script is written on purpose, so the word violence is the first thing you hear. And you immediately, violence is going on. You guys, why they're not talking about the demands of the French people, which is what the sources I am talking about. They're talking about how the French people come together, the unity they have, the demands they're making as a populace to hold the police accountable, the demands they're making on Emmanuel Macron. None of this is covered in the corporate media in the West. They're covering the violence, the destruction. And as they said, look at the violent protests, and then they show clips of no violence. Like, property damage is not violence. I didn't see anyone get mugged. Did you guys see anyone get mugged during that compilation they showed? Not a goddamn one. So they just say violence, violence, violence. They just want your brain to immediately associate any protest, any discontent with the government as violence. But anyway, let's continue.
Biggest violence in Marseille in the south Mediterranean port city, and Lyon in the center of the country. And it was on the outskirts there where those 2 police officers were shot. So overall, a slight tamping down, but in part because the security presence is just bigger and stronger.
This teenager's funeral is today. What do we know about the traffic stop? What happened around that has everybody so up in arms?
Yeah, the incident literally happened here behind me. The beaten post and the flowers you can see, that's where his vehicle crashed into after he was shot. A police officer has been detained and has been charged with voluntary homicide.
Look at this soft language. So when talking about the protest, it's violence. It's violence when it's talking about the protest. This officer shot this kid. No, he murdered this guy on a traffic stop. And then my question is, and once again, I'll co-found the man, so these are the questions we ask all the time. Why do you have a gun during a traffic stop? You know they got this thing called license plate.
This is more recent. Yeah, this is what I was talking about earlier. This didn't used to be this way up until very, very recently, right? This is not something that French people are used to.
It was after the 2015 terrorist attacks. They changed the law.
They changed it.
Charges. He says that he was legally entitled to discharge his weapon. The funeral for now is going on. The services are sort of underway right now. There is a funeral home, his body being taken right now from the funeral home to a mosque for a service, and then to a cemetery in the next couple of hours. So these very tense moments in this neighborhood is happening not far from here, and very sort of, if you will, the possibility.
You notice they show you all the evidence of so-called violence property. Why aren't they saying, they just said he was shot and then the police says he had the right to shoot him? Okay, let's move on. Why aren't you saying what the witnesses are saying? Why aren't you saying what the family is saying about the shooting? It's intentional. So this foreign correspondence, don't let the accent fool you. They've been trained in American propaganda. He know quite well not to use softer language when describing what the police officer did. And just think about it. He went like a full minute. What I didn't mention, he mentioned the kid. Oh, it was over a kid's death, and then he went all of this violence, all this other stuff, and then he had to come back to it because he was asked about it. He had to come back to. He didn't say, let's talk about the kid. Why wasn't the kid in the traffic stop the major point of this segment? Because he's trained in American propaganda.
Yeah, and this used to be. I mean, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'm saying, like, one of the things that made the George Floyd killing, not unique, but it made it impossible for them to couch it this way because there was tape. Right, there was video. We all saw what happened. Right, so they couldn't frame it as well. You see over here on this corner where it happened. No, everybody could see it. Right, everybody could see it. So it was less vulnerable to narrative or any sort of like manipulation of narrative.
Right, and that's to your point. That's what the police state uses. The absence of that evidence, and they know. Exactly, well, I'm the cop. You're going to believe my narrative, in court, and everybody may not know that, but that is the case. I've been in court many times, and the cop's word is treated like fact, like science.
But violence decreases, or I think the authorities really looking at how events play out today, but obviously very tense because of the funeral right now.
like there's no like acknowledgement. Like you're really good to label people's being upset as violence, but there's no like acknowledgement, no characterization of a child being killed. There's no like emotion, no sort of description that describes like this sort of event being bad on the state's part. Regardless of what you feel you had a right, there is a person who's under 18 who is dead. Why isn't the sentiment from that perspective? Even in American media, it's never from that perspective. Go ahead.
Well, see, because corporate media has that narrative to, again, appease people and keep people in the dark about what the establishment is doing and who is enforcing the establishment's laws. Unfortunately, this young kid lost his life. And the thing is, perhaps, again, maybe because communities had to deal with ongoing corruption, lack of economic opportunities, and mobile, the ability to move upwards, you have resentment and anger, and it's starting to boil out. Now, I wish we could get some kind of real change and push back against the establishment here. But if anything, what I would say to the people of France or anywhere else, you don't want what we got here. It's savor the ability to at least speak out against the establishment, because we could be looking at the last pushback of human might against the powers that be.
And this issue is where so many people fail the test. And this is why I don't take you seriously if you get this issue wrong. Because you have people who decry violence of the protesters. And this is what RBN respect. We respect consistency. If you don't like people burning stuff, you don't like the quote unquote violence of protesters, that's never shown. There's always private property. But if you don't like what they do, there's people that always condemn them. They never have anything to say about the police state. And I see this a lot in the George Floyd narrative, where they say, oh my God, the George Floyd protesters, they were violent, it was burning. There is no acknowledgement of the police who escalated the situation. And I am reporting on the ground, many people talk about the George Floyd protest, they was not there. There's so many people who pontificate over the George Floyd protest. They condemn the protesters, and they was not fucking there. I was there. You want to know what happened? Things got a little rowdy at Kansas City. You want to know who started it? The police. So when the people condemn the protesters for violence, why is there never the combination of the police? I will respect you. That's your position. If you're a pacifist and you're like, man, I don't like what the protesters are doing, but I also condemn the police, I will respect that. But what does it mean? So many of these coward, bootlicking people, especially on the right wing, they'll be like, oh my God, you guys are protesting too hard. And they will completely ignore the police that's escalating situations like Emmanuel Macron police force did as they respond with armed tactical units against civilians. They responded with armed vehicles against civilians. They tear gas us at Kansas City. You guys know tear gas is a war crime. A war crime that they normalize using on the population. And then whenever the protests get upset, whenever they get rowdy because the police assault them, they use agent provocateurs to elicit crowds. Then people are like, oh my God, look at the fucking rowdy proletariat. Whenever I see people say that, I'm like, you failed the test. Because even if you sound good on the issues, when shit get real, I know what side you're going to take. You're going to take the side of the state, and you're going to yell at the pesky proletariat for protesting the government too hard. Anyway, that's my last round there. I'll let us finish the segment. Go ahead, kid.
No.
I would like to ask some of these guys on the streets of France how they feel about expanding the court.
No, better yet, ask them how much steam they got left in their train.
Yeah, how much steam? Yeah.
All right. So listen, I would seriously like to ask you guys. I mean, in a serious way. So look, when I was a child, a lot of things like this were going on, and I was a precocious kid, so I remember it well. And it ended with Reagan. So that is always what concerns me with images like this. For me, in terms of what you're talking about, Nick, yeah, man, I'm with you. We also have to look at, do we wind up empowering the right wing with things like this? It's a legitimate question. I lived through it. A lot of the era that we're living in now is a result of a right-wing backlash against left movements that sometimes spilled out into images like that scared the shit out of the people in the suburbs. That's a reality. That's a reality. I've talked to communists who don't like things like this for that reason, who don't like this because they feel like it
but we
empowers
got
the
we
right
got to
wing.
correct the narrative, because a lot of these situations, as I explained, is state violence being directed at us. And what right do we have to defend ourselves? What right do we have to community defense? And now, to your point about popular support, when you look at successful social change, it comes through these intense struggles. And capitalists never going to concede without any struggle. So whether we have the struggle or not, they're going to continue to pillage. They're going to continue to use violence on us. Whether we are passive or not, they're going to steal our wealth. Whether we are passive or not, I think if you look at the last few decades, the Black community has been very nice. I think we assimilate. I think we try to have dreams of grandeur, try to have the American dream, try to have suburbs. But Black income inequality is worse. You got the police killing Black people, despite the fact that many people abandon the militaristic ideology of the Black Panther. So the argument I would make, there is a fine road. I'm not gonna say you're completely wrong, because there is a fine road. We gotta make sure we got a good social image. But we either fight the struggle the correct way we need to fight it, that illicit social change that we need, or the state that can continue to advance state violence on us no matter what. But I think you bring up good points overall, and it's something that activists and movements have to be aware of. To be clear, but I think there is a certain point, and I think it has been shown historically many times, where the community band together and defend ourselves in our lives, and we can gain social support by the power of our movement, the power of our message, and just by the state, the people seeing the state behave belligerently. And that's why narrative control is extremely important. We can't back down for the narrative. They will paint us as violent, but we got to say, no, it's you who fucking violent. And yes, we're not going to win everyone. We may turn off some people. We may not win every single struggle. But I think we just got to be on point our message, and we got to have a ton of discipline and try to win heart and mind. I think that's the combination of the revolution. But we talked to Eddie Liger in Midwestern Marks. I give him credit. He said something I pretty much agree with as well. We try to do everything we can to prevent things from getting to this point, and that's right. We actually play defense a lot of time. We warn people ahead of time, but then when things get real, we gotta be realistic about the reality that we face. But anyway, I think I'm kind of rambling. Those
well, but also what I would also say, what I would add to that, Nick, is that this fear of a right wing backlash. Oh, okay, so all this unrest is going to lead to Marine Le Pen winning, right? Oh, well, this is going to be bad because now Le Pen's going to win. Well, you have Macron now. Yeah. Who's awful now. So that kind of sounds like a similar type of argument you would make. Well, if we riot in the streets, Trump's going to win. Okay, well, we have Biden now, right? Like our whole point here as post-duopoly people is that, you have to be willing to risk a quote-unquote right-wing backlash, because what you have now is neither desirable, feasible, or sustainable, right? So, like, how much do you actually fear the right-wing backlash when what you have is awful? And in France, I mean, they changed those laws. They empowered the cops more. And Nick, to your point, you said, they did this to enforce a sort of neoliberal state. Well, I think it was the year or two after they armed most of the cops was when that yellow vest movement started, right? What did they know? Well, we're going to start passing a gas tax soon, and the people are going to get rowdy, so we better arm the cops in anticipation of that, right? And so what you have is a sort of neoliberal, sort of centrist state, whether it's here or there, sort of creating all of these conditions that are, of course, going to create unrest. And they use the cops to try and crack down on that. So right-wing backlash, I mean, that the only reason to be afraid of that is if you actually are more afraid of Trump than you are of Biden, or you're more afraid of Le Pen than you are of their current government now. I think once things get to a point, people feel like they have nothing to lose, and that's where this stuff comes from in the first place.
And we got before. Go ahead, Russell. Go ahead.
Well, okay. I think kind of the middle ground that I would see, and from consulting with some of my, revolutionary communist friends, when you have undirected action like this, that can wind up being counterproductive. If you look at what the reaction was when they burned Goldman Sachs a couple of months ago, it's a lot better than burning a local library or burning a local store. When you don't have any kind of control or focus of an action like this, then you can wind up getting actions like that I think are counterproductive. Whereas if it were like, yo, Goldman Sachs is over there, then you can not have that backlash.
That's why we need revolutionary media, because we need to counter the narrative. Because what I would say, that's someone who's been witness of movements in I can only speak of my country, I can speak of France. There's a lot of agent provocateurs. So we would say, like, how what's the evidence that these are people from our movement? Because they would tie people who, and this happened in Ferguson a lot, and I know this a lot because there's a lot of unsavory people in Ferguson. So there's the Ferguson riots that happened, and then people who had nothing to do with the movement will come and steal shit, right? And then obviously the right wingers who act in bad faith, they say, "Oh my God, look at the movement who's supporting looting." And meanwhile, the leaders like, "We don't support this. It's not part of our movement." But that get overshadowed by corporate media, and then the narrative goes around that, "Oh, this movement is full of violent thugs and looters." And once again, your point is not overall wrong, Russell. But that's why we need RBN. That's why Lenin wrote a paper. That's why it's very important to have revolutionary media so we can have something to counteract that. We have people that caught feds and infiltrators during the 2020 protests. There was people who were trying to provoke violence. So as these narratives build up, and I want to be clear, this never happened before. Like every time there were protests, we never had any sort of counter this. So you see a firestorm, you see violence happen, and then the media say, "Oh, this is the fucking movement." But what if we have a media outlet like RBN that can explain this? Because I was a citizen journalist and I reported on the ground. And I'm telling you guys from experience, 2020 in George Floyd, and this anecdotal experience from a citizen journalist, there was Black elders. There was longtime activists that was going around and policing us. They were saying, we want a peaceful protest. We don't want to provoke anything to happen. So the whole theme of the protest is we want peace. We want to spread our message, and we want to come across great. Is that how the protest was covered? No. The corporate media completely erase those people and cover criminals and other people who may have been outside the movement. So to your response, Russell, my only response is we need to be better at messaging and saying these people have nothing to do with our movement. As Marxists, as socialists, we want to build. We don't want to destroy communities, and we want to engage in actual effective tactics. Burn down communities and your own neighborhood. Is that effective tactic? I don't think anyone will agree to that, right? But we need to be clear that the messaging that we do, with the people on the street that I talk to, because I was on the street talking to a lot of people in Kansas City who was passionate about defending our communities, that the people who engage in violence are not part of us. But also another important point, is the agent provocateurs. That is not covered enough. Like we busted a few of them in 2020. And there were stories. You had right-wing infiltrators. You had a lot of white supremacists that during the Black Lives Matter protests, they would start violence, and then you have right-wing media like, "Oh my God, look at all this violence that's going on." Like, how do we know? And this is we need to get better at this. How do we know that everything that the media reporting not a psyop to delegitimize these campaigns? So your thesis is correct. We got to be good at PR too, right? If there's the correct theory, we got to be good at PR, but we got to the failure that we had is being the ability to counter these narratives, which I think we have media like ourselves, yourselves, and more on the ground people that can put back on that. But overall, I still think they got the advantage. Meanwhile, I'm ranting. I think this is a very interesting conversation.